The sun was high and merciless over the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. Smoke curled from the distant ridge where machine guns had barked all morning. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, age 22, knelt in the dirt, his uniform soaked in blood. That wasn't just his. His lips were cracked, eyes wild with terror. His right hand trembled behind his back, tied with a coarse rope by American soldiers. Every breath came shallow. This was it. He remembered what his sergeant had said just days ago as they prepared for their last stand. If you're captured, pray they kill you quickly. The Americans will flay your skin, feed you to dogs, and laugh as you scream. Tanaka had believed it. Every leaflet, every radio broadcast back home told the same thing. Americans were monsters in human skin. He'd seen the propaganda, cartoons of grinning GIs with devil horns, bayoneting women, burning children. Now he was their prisoner. Boots crunched behind him. One of the Americans, tall, tanned, sweat gleaming on his neck, bent down and offered him something, a cup of cold water. Tanaka flinched, expecting poison, but the man just smiled and said, slowly, in broken Japanese, "Drink. You're safe now." In that moment, everything Hiroshi thought he knew about the enemy began to collapse. He hadn't entered hell. He was about to taste America. The lie they were told. They had all been told the same story. From the first day they put on the brown-green uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army, young men like Hiroshi Tanaka were taught that surrender was worse than death. Not just dishonorable, but inhuman. "The enemy shows no mercy," barked instructors with faces hard as stone. "An American will not take you prisoner. He will mutilate you. He will make you beg." In training camps across Japan, soldiers watched grainy black and white films with scratchy narrations warning them of what would happen if they failed. One reel showed a dramatized interrogation scene. An American officer gouging out the eye of a Japanese soldier with a cigarette while jazz music played in the background. Another showed a woman screaming as enemy troops dragged her away from a burning village. "This," the narrator said, "is what awaits those who surrender to the West." It wasn't just the army feeding this fear. Posters hung in city centers and schoolyards, painted in garish reds and blacks, showing demonic caricatures of Americans, towering beasts with bulging muscles, shark-like teeth, and rifles dripping with blood. Children were taught rhymes that warned them to run if they ever saw a foreigner. Newspapers printed fabricated stories of mass torture, of soldiers being skinned alive, of death camps, on distant islands where Japanese captives were dissected like animals. No one questioned it. Because there was no room for doubt in wartime Japan, civilians too were caught in the grip of this madness. When Saipan fell in July of 1944, thousands of Japanese families, women, elderly, even toddlers, threw themselves off the cliffs into the sea, better to die than fall into American hands. The cliffs became known as Suicide Point. Survivors whispered that mothers had leapt with babies in their arms. Some were just little girls, no older than 5. To the Japanese mind, surrender wasn't just failure, it was betrayal. The code of Bushido, once the creed of samurai, had been weaponized into a psychological cage. Better to charge into machine gun fire with a broken rifle than raise your hands and live. And those who did surrender, they were no longer considered Japanese. They were erased. Names struck from family registers, photos removed from household altars. No welcome, no forgiveness. In the last months of the war, fanatical officers told their men, "Fight until you have no bullets, then fight with rocks, then with your teeth, but never, never let them take you alive." And yet, some were taken alive. Not because they wanted to be, but because they had no choice. Shell-shocked, half-starved, crawling out of caves on their bellies, waving blood-soaked rags as flags of surrender. and every one of them expected death. Slow, agonizing, monstrous death. Because that's what they were told. That was the lie. A lie so deeply planted that even when kindness came, they couldn't see it. When water touched their lips, they flinched. When bread was placed in their hands, they sniffed it for poison. When jazz music echoed from the guard tower, they thought it was the soundtrack to an execution. But soon, one bite, one song, one word at a time, that lie would begin to crack. And for some, it would break entirely. Because what the Japanese POWs found on American soil wasn't a slaughterhouse. It was something they had never expected, a world of abundance, of freedom, of strange food, strange music, and a very different kind of enemy. The moment of capture. It began with the dirt. The rich, volcanic earth of Iwo Jima was sticky with blood and ash, hot to the touch, littered with spent cartridges and shredded helmets. For Hiroshi Tanaka, crawling out of the mouth of a collapsed tunnel, the air itself felt like acid, thick with cordite and decay. Behind him lay 32 of his fellow soldiers. Only he was breathing. The cave had been sealed by a satchel charge. The explosion knocked out his hearing. For hours he'd clawed at the dirt in darkness, the air running out, lungs screaming. When the rubble finally gave way to the surface, he wasn't met with the roar of battle, but with an eerie, unnatural silence. And then, shouting, not Japanese, English, boots, dozens of them. Hands grabbed his arms roughly, a gun barrel pressed against the base of his skull. He didn't fight. He waited for the shot. None came. Instead, his hands were tied, gently, not cruelly. A soldier offered him water. He refused. Another handed him a square of chocolate, unwrapped. He dropped it, convinced it was a trap. Around him, other Japanese soldiers emerged one by one, ragged and wide-eyed. Some wept openly. Others stared into the distance, already halfway gone in their minds. They had expected to die with honor. Instead, they were herded onto trucks like livestock, shaking, skeletal, sunburned. One soldier, barely more than a boy, muttered, "They're taking us to the crematorium." Another whispered, "They will skin us alive." But none of that happened. Instead, they were driven to a makeshift field camp, given clean water, medical checks, and, unbelievably, rice. Real rice, cooked, with pickled vegetables. Hiroshi took one bite and sobbed. He didn't understand. Why feed prisoners? Why not let them rot? Where were the beatings? Where were the punishments? That night, under canvas tents strung up by the U.S. Marines, the wind carried a strange sound across the jungle hills. It wasn't gunfire. It was music. From a radio perched on a mess tent table, a smooth tenor voice sang in English, "I'll be seeing you, in all the old familiar places." It was the first American song Hiroshi ever heard. He didn't know the words, but the tone, the softness, it made him ache. This was not the enemy he had been taught to fear. A few days later, Hiroshi and nearly 200 other POWs were moved by boat to a larger facility on Guam. American nurses treated their wounds with care. One even smiled at him. A woman, smiling, at a Japanese soldier. He didn't know whether to bow or cry. On board the ship, he saw something that shook him more than any explosion. Marines, young, loud, sunburnt, laughing and sharing cigarettes. One sat down beside Hiroshi and tried to speak. "Name?" the Marine asked, pointing. "Hiroshi," he whispered. The Marine grinned. "Joe," he said, patting his own chest. Then he handed Hiroshi a piece of jerky and a folded magazine. "Life," it said in bold letters. Inside were photographs of smiling American families, gleaming cars, women in swimsuits, skyscrapers that touched clouds. A different world, a ridiculous world, a free one. As the boat rocked across the Pacific, Hiroshi stared out at the horizon and asked himself the question that would haunt him for years. If these people are monsters, why do they feed their enemies? Why do they smile? Why do they sing? By the time they reached the U.S. mainland, most of the prisoners had stopped flinching at kindness. Not because they trusted it, but because they were too tired to resist. They were processed like guests, not livestock. Given fresh uniforms, simple khaki overalls, blankets, soap, toothbrushes. Names were recorded with care. No beatings, no dogs, no humiliation. Instead of camps ringed with barbed wire and screaming guards, they were sent to places that looked more like quiet summer retreats, pine forests, open fields, wooden barracks, and always, there was food, eggs, bread, peanut butter, even meat, grilled over open flame, the scent curling into the morning sky like incense. The smell alone felt like a sin. They hadn't just been spared. They were being welcomed, and that terrified them more than any gun ever could. The prison that felt like America. The bus rolled slowly through a grove of tall pine trees, their needles whispering in the breeze. Dust kicked up behind the wheels as the convoy turned down a gravel road. Hiroshi Tanaka sat stiffly in his seat, hands folded in his lap, eyes darting out the window. He expected walls, guard towers, barbed wire and barking dogs. He imagined iron bars and chains. But instead, he saw grass, endless, green, American grass, and a white picket fence. The bus stopped at the entrance to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, one of over 10 official POW camps spread across the American heartland. Tanaka and the other Japanese prisoners filed out quietly, blinking in the late spring sun. There were guards, yes, rifles slung over shoulders, pistols at their sides. But they weren't shouting. They weren't even scowling. One of them chewed gum and waved lazily toward the barracks. The buildings were wooden, painted tan, long and neat like country schoolhouses. Laundry fluttered on clotheslines between them. Somewhere nearby, a radio played music again, jazz, up-tempo, bouncy, something called Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. A prisoner beside Hiroshi whispered, "It's a trick." But if it was a very convincing one. Inside the barracks, there were bunk beds, clean ones, mattresses, sheets, blankets, not straw, not mats on dirt floors. There were showers with hot water, toilets that flushed, a dining hall with tables, chairs, and food that seemed to never stop coming. That first night, dinner was served on metal trays: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and a slice of apple pie. Apple pie. It wasn't a trick. It was a meal. Over the coming days, the strangeness only deepened. Each morning began with roll call, followed by breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Then came work detail, but not the kind Hiroshi feared. He wasn't forced to dig trenches or haul stone in the sun. Instead, he helped fix fences, painted walls, even raked leaves. Tasks that kept the camp clean and gave the prisoners purpose. In the afternoons, they had free time. Some read books from the camp library, translated American novels, history texts, and even Japanese literature. Others played cards, a few practiced calligraphy, and slowly the most daring began to explore the strange American pastimes offered to them: baseball, ping pong, jazz records, and barbecue. On Sundays, the smell of grilled meat drifted from the camp kitchen. Burgers sizzled over open flames. Buns warmed on the grill. The prisoners were invited to sit, eat, and even chat, with each other, and sometimes, astonishingly, with the guards. Hiroshi sat across from a young soldier from Iowa one afternoon. The man poured him a soda, something fizzy and sweet and cold. Root beer. It made Hiroshi sneeze and laugh at the same time. The guard chuckled and said, "First one's always weird." It wasn't just the food, or the music, or the comfort. It was the dignity. In the Japanese army, prisoners had no worth. They were ghosts, shameful, forgotten. But here, he was still a prisoner, yes, but a person too. He was called by name, asked what he needed, given space to think, and that terrified him, because he didn't know how to think anymore. Some of the older prisoners resisted. They sat stiffly during meals, refusing to eat more than rice. They muttered that the Americans were trying to poison them with kindness, that the food was a spell, that the music was meant to weaken their resolve. But others, especially the younger men, began to change. They hummed the tunes. They asked for seconds. They stared at American magazines with wide, hungry eyes, photos of baseball stars, of movie actresses, of smiling families in front of huge refrigerators filled with food. Hiroshi found a picture of a supermarket in one issue of the Saturday Evening Post, a place with aisles, and aisles of cans and boxes and fruit. He stared at it for an hour. That night he dreamed of walking through that store, hands full, no one yelling, no rationing, no sirens, just light and plenty. Education classes began a few weeks later, voluntary, but many signed up. American officers brought in translators, books, chalkboards. They taught English, American civics, even explained how elections worked. Hiroshi listened, skeptical at first, then curious. One day, a Japanese professor, himself a former prisoner, now working with the Americans, stood at the front of the classroom and said something that shook them all. "You were taught to die for the emperor. But have you ever asked what the emperor dies for?" The room was silent. Another day, they read the U.S. Constitution, translated line by line. "We, the people." It sounded impossible. Government by the people, not by generals, not by sacred bloodlines. Hiroshi wrote in his notebook that night, "If I had known this before, would I have fought so hard?" Evenings brought more music, jazz, swing, and something called the blues. Sad songs that sounded like someone had torn open their chest and put the ache into notes. It didn't matter that the lyrics were in English. The feeling was universal. Some prisoners learned to play instruments, clarinet, trumpet, even piano. One, a former band member from Osaka, formed a trio with 2 guards. They called themselves the Campfire Three. One Saturday night, they performed in the mess hall. Prisoners and guards sat side by side, tapping feet. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. A Japanese prisoner stood and sang, a love song, not for a woman, but for a memory. When the final note faded, there was silence, then applause. And for a moment, Hiroshi forgot he was in prison at all. He wasn't free, not yet. But something inside him had cracked open, not broken, opened, like a door he never knew was there. And through that door, a different world waited, louder, stranger, freer. And it all started with a plate of barbecue. Shock and soft power. At first, the shock came in waves. The first was physical. How full the air smelled. Even the simplest meal at Camp McCoy carried aromas Hiroshi Tanaka had never experienced in wartime Japan. Roasted meat, buttered corn, the tang of mustard. The kitchen served pork chops on Wednesdays, chicken on Fridays. On special occasions, like the 4th of July, there were entire roasts, piles of sweet potatoes, trays of brownies. No ration cards, no rice porridge, no hunger. But the real shock was psychological. How could this enemy, the same country that had firebombed Tokyo, that had crushed the Imperial Navy, offer such abundance to its prisoners? One afternoon, Hiroshi asked a guard through broken English, "Why, so much food?" The guard shrugged. "You're people, not animals." That reply haunted Hiroshi more than any insult ever could. Days passed into weeks. The routine became familiar, almost too familiar. Breakfast at 7, work detail or study, lunch at noon, Free time, recreation, music, dinner, often followed by a movie projected onto a bedsheet. American classics, silent films, even comedies. The prisoners didn't understand the language, but laughter, it turns out, needed no translation. Charlie Chaplin was universal. Hiroshi remembered a scene where Chaplin slipped on a banana peel, flailed, and fell into a fountain. The room exploded with laughter, Japanese prisoners laughing until their stomachs hurt, some for the first time in years. It was surreal. To laugh. While the war still raged across the Pacific, the Americans encouraged letters home, paper, envelopes, postage, all provided. Most POWs had no one to write to. Families in Japan didn't acknowledge captured sons, but some, like Hiroshi, wrote anyway. "Dear Mother," he began one letter, "I am alive, and I am well. Please do not be ashamed of me." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her about the jazz, the apple pie, the books, the hot showers, but he didn't know how. He wasn't sure she'd believe it. He wasn't sure he did. As summer turned to fall, education classes expanded. Lectures on American democracy, history, labor unions. Some prisoners scoffed, others took notes. One afternoon, a visiting Japanese-American professor delivered a talk on civil rights. He showed pictures of segregated buses in Alabama, but also of the Japanese internment camps. He did not hide American flaws. Instead, he emphasized choice. "In America," he said, "you are free to speak, even against the government." A prisoner raised his hand. "And if you do?" The professor smiled. "They argue with you, not shoot you." Laughter rippled through the room. Nervous laughter. Disbelieving. Another man asked, "And anyone can vote?" "Yes, if you are a citizen." "Even the poor?" "Especially the poor." That night, Hiroshi wrote in his journal, "I don't know if they're telling the truth, but if they are, then everything we were taught was a lie. Soft power." The Americans never used that term in the camps, but that's what it was. No speeches, no loud conversions, just kindness, structure, dignity. They didn't break the prisoners. They let them rebuild themselves. And somewhere in that slow reconstruction, the cracks in imperial ideology grew wider. On Sundays, Protestant chaplains visited. They didn't preach. They brought books, played music, and sometimes just talked. A few Japanese POWs converted to Christianity, not from pressure, but from curiosity. One man said he liked the idea of forgiveness. "Our gods do not forgive," he said quietly, "only punish." Others found solace in poetry or gardening. Hiroshi grew tomatoes behind Barrack 6. He marveled when they ripened, red, plump, thriving in foreign soil. He named one plant Shizuko after his sister. The guards, too, were part of this strange transformation. They were not saints. Some were distant. A few were cruel. But most treated the prisoners not like captives, but like co-workers. One taught a prisoner how to fish. Another played harmonica during roll call. One sergeant, known only as Big Mike, brought in a box of donuts once a week. He said it was for morale. "Whose morale?" a fellow guard joked. Mike shrugged. "Everyone's." It worked. One October evening, as leaves turned gold across Wisconsin, a group of prisoners staged a kabuki play for the camp. Guards watched, quietly respectful. When the final curtain fell, a bedsheet tied to broom handles, the applause was genuine. Some of the prisoners cried. So did one of the guards. It wasn't sympathy, it was connection. The war was still far from over, but for these men, on this small patch of borrowed American land, a different kind of battle was being won. Not with bombs, not with bullets, but with bread and jazz. And the radical idea that an enemy could become, if not a friend, then at least a fellow human being. POWs in Japanese hands, While Japanese prisoners in America played baseball and learned English, a very different reality unfolded thousands of miles away, in places with names that would become synonymous with cruelty: Changi, Burma, Bataan. There it was Allied soldiers who were the prisoners, and Imperial Japan who held the keys. For many of them, the war never ended. It just changed shape. At Changi Prison in Singapore, nearly 15,000 Allied troops were held after the British surrender in 1942. Designed to house 600 inmates, the facility became a city of suffering. Food rations were barely survival grade, bowls of thin rice porridge twice a day. Meat, if it appeared at all, was gray and stringy, sometimes rat or dog. Medical supplies were non-existent. When diseases swept through the compound, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, there was little to do but dig graves. Guards patrolled the camp with bamboo sticks, their eyes trained for any sign of resistance or insolence. Men were beaten for walking too slowly, for bowing incorrectly, for speaking out of turn. Others were forced to kneel in the hot sun for hours as punishment, or dig holes only to fill them again. Then there was the Burma Railway. Built through the unforgiving jungles of Thailand and Burma, it would be nicknamed the Death Railway, for good reason. Over 60,000 Allied POWs, including Australians, British, and Dutch soldiers, were forced to construct the railway by hand. Tools were scarce. Dynamite was a luxury. Most dug and hammered with rusted picks and bare hands. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day in monsoon rains under the lashes of Japanese and Korean overseers. Disease ran rampant. Food was deliberately withheld to break spirits. Torture was a tool of discipline. If a man fell from exhaustion, he was often left behind. By the time the line was completed, over 12,000 prisoners were dead. Another 90,000 Asian laborers, mostly conscripted civilians, also perished. Their stories, often forgotten, are no less brutal. One survivor of the railway wrote, "The worst part was not the pain. It was the way they looked at us, as if we were insects, as if we had no soul." On the Japanese home islands, American airmen captured during bombing raids faced a grim fate. Many were not sent to POW camps at all. They were paraded through streets, pelted with rocks by civilians, then executed without trial. Some were dissected alive at medical universities, used as living cadavers in wartime experiments. The contrast was not merely in policy, it was philosophical. To Imperial Japan, surrender was a crime, a denial of the emperor's divine authority. A soldier who surrendered lost his humanity, and if he was no longer human, then anything could be done to him. To the Americans, at least officially, the Geneva Convention held sway. POWs were to be protected, not punished, humiliated perhaps, but not destroyed. That difference in belief shaped everything. News of Japanese atrocities reached American shores slowly, through survivor testimonies, Red Cross reports, intercepted messages. And yet, despite these horrors, Japan was shocked when its own POWs were treated humanely. The empire had assumed reciprocity, that cruelty would be met with cruelty, that America would mirror their worst instincts, but that wasn't what happened. And in some ways, that was more powerful than any weapon. Because while Imperial Japan broke bodies, the United States won minds, one bowl of stew at a time, one kindness at a time. And for the Japanese prisoners who saw it firsthand, the realization was seismic. They had been told that the West was decadent, savage, godless. But here, in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, they were discovering something else. That dignity, once given, is hard to forget. And that sometimes the most subversive weapon in a war is mercy. The mind begins to shift. The first time Hiroshi Tanaka said the word America out loud, he whispered it like it was a secret. He was sitting beneath a maple tree behind the barracks, watching a baseball game unfold between guards and prisoners. The sound of the bat cracking against the ball echoed across the open field. A fellow POW nudged him. "You understand the rules yet?" the man asked, smirking. Hiroshi shook his head. "Still think it's just cricket with shouting." The two of them laughed, a small, cautious sound, like something that had to be relearned. Around them, laughter was no longer rare. Jokes passed between bunkmates, nicknames were given. Some prisoners even started to mimic American slang. "Okay, buddy," they'd say to each other, grinning. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. The propaganda was starting to unravel. Back home, Hiroshi had memorized every imperial slogan. 100 million hearts beating as one. Death before dishonor. The West is rotten, decadent, weak. But here in the camp, that rot tasted like cherry pie. That weakness looked like baseball games and jukeboxes. That decadence, it smelled like barbecue and clean laundry. And slowly, Hiroshi began to ask the question that scared him most. What if they were right about us and wrong about them? The shift was quiet, internal, but unmistakable. Prisoners who once bowed rigidly toward the east each morning began to skip the ritual. Some even stopped speaking of the emperor altogether. A few took American nicknames: Jimmy, Mike, Charlie, part joke, part adaptation. At first, it caused friction. "You've forgotten who you are," one older soldier snapped when Hiroshi read an English magazine at lunch. "No," Hiroshi said. "I'm remembering I'm human." That silenced the room. Language became the bridge. Each day, Hiroshi practiced English with a sergeant named Frank. They met outside the mess hall after breakfast, sitting on upturned crates. Frank taught him idioms, expressions, and how to pronounce R, without sounding like he was chewing gravel. One morning, Hiroshi asked, "Why do you treat us well?" Frank didn't answer right away. He looked off at the pine trees swaying in the distance, then said, "Because we want to be better than the war." That phrase stayed with Hiroshi for days. Better than the war. He wrote it in his journal. Then he wrote it again in Japanese. Then again in English. By the end of the week, it had become a kind of mantra. The changes weren't just individual, they were communal. Camp leaders among the POWs began organizing reading groups, discussion circles, even debates about Japan's future. Topics once forbidden were suddenly on the table. Democracy, free speech, women's rights, war crimes. One prisoner, a former university professor from Kyoto, began lecturing on philosophy. "We believed the emperor was divine," he said, standing beneath a flagpole where no flag flew. "But here, we see that dignity can exist without divinity." No one argued. Because they were living proof, Hiroshi wrote home again. This time, he included more than just the basic required lines. "Mother," he wrote, "I know I shamed the family by being captured. But I must tell you something. The Americans, they are not demons. They are not monsters. They are kind, proud, and yes, powerful, but also gentle." He paused before writing the next part. "I am not a traitor. I am a witness." He didn't know if the letter would arrive. If it did, he doubted it would be read without scrutiny. But he had to try. Because something inside him had shifted. Not just his view of the war, but his view of humanity. The final test came in the form of a choice. Late in 1944, the U.S. military began offering POWs an opportunity. Join work programs on nearby farms, factories, or logging sites. Participation was voluntary. Pay was minimal. But the conditions were real. Actual civilian labor, beyond the fences. Many refused. They still feared a trick, but Hiroshi said yes. He was sent to a dairy farm in rural Wisconsin, And there, surrounded by cows, wheat fields, and curious American children, his transformation became complete. The farmer and his wife, Bill and Edna, treated him like a guest. They fed him hearty meals, let him sit at the table, even taught him how to drive a tractor. Their son, maybe 10 years old, asked one night at dinner, "Mom, was he our enemy?" Edna smiled and placed a hand on Hiroshi's shoulder. "Not anymore." Hiroshi didn't speak for the rest of the meal. His throat was too tight. When he returned to the camp weeks later, the other POWs gathered around him, hungry for stories. He didn't talk about tractors. He talked about kindness, trust, second chances. He talked about the dog that slept on the porch, and the cookies the boy's mother baked on Saturdays, and the fireflies that lit the cornfields at night like floating lanterns. And then he said something that stunned even himself. "I don't want to go back." He would go back, of course. The war would end. Ships would arrive. Repatriation would begin. But Hiroshi knew, whatever Japan had waiting for him, he would never be the same man who crawled out of that cave on Iwo Jima. Because America hadn't just spared him. It had changed him. From the inside out. Returning home. The long shadow of kindness. The ships came in the fall of 1945. Painted gray, flying white flags, they docked slowly along the Pacific ports where Japanese prisoners stood in rows, thinner, older, and somehow quieter than when they'd arrived. Hiroshi Tanaka stood among them, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside it were only a few things: a photo of the Iowa farm family who'd fed him, a harmonica, given by a camp guard, and a folded letter he'd never sent. The war was over. The Emperor had spoken, his voice broadcast for the first time in history, declaring surrender in tones so sorrowful they didn't sound human. Now came the return, and the reckoning. The journey back across the Pacific was uneventful, almost solemn. No cheering, no songs, just the endless sound of waves against steel and the low hum of engines carrying them toward a country they no longer recognized. They disembarked in silence. The docks were crowded with Red Cross workers, soldiers, officials, but not families. There were no mothers waiting with outstretched arms, no wives, no sisters. To most, they were not returning heroes. They were returning shame, former prisoners, men who had failed to die for the Emperor. Hiroshi arrived in Tokyo to find it reduced to bones and ash. The great imperial city had been firebombed nearly to oblivion. Entire neighborhoods flattened, rivers choked with debris, silence broken only by the clatter of bicycles and the hollow sound of wind through ruins. His family home was gone. Only a slab of concrete remained where the kitchen had once been. He found his sister, Shizuko, living in a crowded shelter near Ueno Park. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw him. Not just joy, but fear, confusion, disbelief. "You lived?" she whispered. He nodded. "I thought you would never come back." "I almost didn't," he said. Then he smiled weakly. "But the Americans had jazz." She stared at him. "What?" And so, over rice and tea in a cracked ceramic bowl, he told her everything: the camp, the food, the music, the books, the laughter, the kindness. She listened, but said little. Afterward, she looked down and said, "You sound like one of them." "I sound like someone who learned to listen," he replied. She didn't argue, but she didn't speak again that night. Outside the camps, Japan was undergoing its own transformation. Under American occupation, General Douglas MacArthur initiated sweeping reforms: democratization, women's suffrage, land redistribution. Factories once used for bombs now made radios. Propaganda offices were dismantled, school books rewritten, and into this fragile new world returned men like Hiroshi, POWs who had seen the West with their own eyes and lived to tell about it. They were not celebrated. They were not trusted, but some of them found purpose. They became interpreters, teachers, rebuilders. They translated documents, taught English, even advised the new Japanese government on Western customs. A few served as unofficial diplomats, explaining America not as a theory, but as a lived experience. One former POW became a radio broadcaster. Another opened a jazz club in Kyoto. Hiroshi found work at a local newspaper writing small stories, mostly about weather, community events, local heroes. But sometimes, when the editor allowed it, he wrote essays. Quiet pieces, reflective. One was titled, "The Enemy with a Cup of Water." It was read by thousands. No one sent him letters, but no one stopped him either. Years passed. Japan rose. From ashes to factories, from war to neon, from silence to skyscrapers. But for Hiroshi, the transformation had started long before. In a prison camp. In a field. In a moment when a man who was supposed to be his executioner instead handed him a cup of water, cold, clean, undeniable. He never forgot it. The way the guard's hand trembled slightly, the way he smiled, not with mockery, but with some strange, aching recognition. The war was full of guns, yes, but sometimes mercy was louder. One winter evening, decades later, Hiroshi stood before a classroom of university students. He was older now, white-haired, gentle. One student asked, "Do you regret being captured?" "No," he said. "Why not?" Hiroshi paused. Then he said, "Because I learned that America didn't defeat me with bombs. They defeated me with decency." Silence. He looked out the window. Snow was falling, and somewhere in the distance, faintly, as if from memory itself, a jazz melody seemed to echo through the wind. What shocked you most in this story? Tell us in the comments, and if this made you see the war in a new light, don't forget to like and share.